Right.
Sekejap je dah. Tak puas.
It's live streaming, guys.
Okay.
That means my business.
Wait, just a second. Who's starting? No. No. I will. I have. Yeah. I will. I hope no other phone is on though for the money. That's confusing.
I just love that idea, and I bet all of us in this room at this exact time love that idea of innovation alone. But the one thing that I want to pose the question towards the opposition is that is innovation exactly a necessity for the country to reach and go beyond 2020? Now, this is what we want from the opposition to prove. But here's I'm going to tell you why it is not a necessity, and I'm going to do two things in today's debate. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how the objective in our today's debate, how specialization leads to a better growth in the for the country's economy and go beyond 2020. And the second thing is why spending on intervention is a bad idea. I will shorten the. But before I do so, let's clarify a few things about today's debate. Right. Okay. Basically, a creation or research of something that is not already there in current series score or in the current nation's economy. Right. Okay. What is our yardstick to what is existing? Our yardstick is very simple. Anything that is not underneath the already specification of the government under the NKIA, which is the national key economic area, is that anything beyond that is we counted as innovation. Anything under that, we're just going to take it as improvement. Sorry, sit down. We're going to take it as improvement and and better development, not innovation. Innovation is anything beyond that. Now, what is the national key economic area? For example, things like narrowing disparities, where we invest in smaller businesses. How a greater KL, where we develop in order to attract more tourism, or even develop for the people's use of the mother nation, right? Okay, these are the things that are already existing in Malaysia, and how the government has chosen the right way to focus on these things instead of going for other new things. Why so? Let me give you a statistic of the things that the government focus on under the NKIA, which is, for example, the agriculture. In this year alone, it is increased by 4% because the government chose to not innovate any more new ideas. Instead, they choose to focus on and develop these things even more because it will bring a better increase in the economy. Second thing, another example is they chose to focus on construction. For example, I gave to you the Greater KL. Now the construction is increased by 9.6%, which contributes towards the increase of economy of Malaysia by 5.6%, just because the government chose to focus on the things that are already there instead of making new ones. Now, sit down. Now, moving on to what do you mean by the backseat? What I mean by backseat is very, very simple. The government shouldn't actively fund towards funding new things. That is it. It's very simple. The government choose what we believe what the government should do is focus on what is already there and developing it to be even much better. As an example I've given you before, funding new things is a very huge risk. I will explain to you in my further explanation. And the third thing, and the last thing that I want to clarify about the debate is okay, things like what is innovation. I'm going to give you an example for the opposition to see what we mean by innovation. Innovation are the things, for example, let's say beyond NKIA, for example, like making your own smartphone, or like putting wind turbine in Malaysia, which they might say it is impossible, but with innovation, it might be possible. These are the things we don't see that the government should be spending on. Instead, focus on what's already there. But before I move on to my arguments, yes.
Yeah, so existing technologies that the state would like to take and build other things, existing forms of technologies in medicine and education, you're prohibiting that. I just
Sorry, sir. That's just development, sir, not innovation. Now, moving on to the burden of it today. What we're saying is that we believe in sustaining a better growth. Why so? Our aim is to achieve 2020. That was what Tun Mahathir said before that. But our aim now, as a developing country, we want to aim beyond 2020. And what is important? We must sustain the economy. Just because Malaysia has achieved the 15,000 USD per capita are enough to say, okay, we reach it, so we just lay back. No, it needs sustainability for it to be for us to go and progress beyond 2020. Now, sit down. Now, what is the problem that we face in the government today? This directly clashes to their idea of innovation. Why? First of all, the government is focusing on too many things. They already have a lot of things in their plate that they have to cater to. The people, the economics, the social, the development. And this is why we see that innovation is a very new thing that is introduced into this plate, which we believe is better off for the government to not be with them. Why so? Because we believe, and exactly how we explained for, focusing on this development of these things already exist is better. Yes, before I move on, yes.
So your biggest issue is the money doesn't have enough money. Are you trying to say then innovation is a good idea, but only if the private industry takes it up because we're too busy with 2020?
Kind of be a little bit of both. Why? So, because it is not only a problem of resources. What we're saying is that government has a lot of things to do. Just because you have a lot of things to do doesn't mean you don't have enough money. We're saying focusing on the things that already is there. UK, for example, if you want to spend, because financial resources are very finite, right? If you choose to spend, you're losing a lot of portion that you can put into developing, into doing the things that are already there. I explained before the increase in the economy. Now, moving on to the objective of today's debate. What we want is basically achieve a high income nation and sustain it as the idea of going beyond 2020 is. We want to sustain the economy. How so? For example, I'll give you an example of the government choosing to focus instead of innovating. Or 2012 is 287 billion. Okay, that is when they start on the idea of development instead of innovation. Right now, the GDP of 2014 12 billion. You can economic value into new ones. Now, the first thing that I would like to go on about is how specialization leads to a better growth of the economy instead of the other. Now, it forces improving of what we have. As I've said before, it improves the things that we already have. If you do for innovation, you're taking out a large amount of resources and putting it in something that could possibly not happen, but very much beneficial. Why so? You're putting your money into things that are already there and just needs to be more developed. And the money is less spent on the things of probabilities, and this is why we see that is much more better towards the economy of the country. Second thing is why spending innovation is a bad idea in going beyond 2020. Why so? The economic is the opportunity to explain why do we need innovation, because we are going in on what we already have. And all right, another thing that why we should believe in innovation is that because the competition of new things is very, very high. What we believe we should do instead is focus on the things that we already have in improving it, make it better, making us champions in those sectors like palm oil, more into there, and it can champion in the international market. What we don't see is the benefits we get in the long, even if in the long run we don't see the benefit outweighs the benefit of us developing, outweighs the benefits of innovation outweighs the benefit of us developing. So please, the opposition, clarify why innovation is important for the economic growth of beyond 2020. With that, we beg to propose.
What opening government needs to realize is what develops your economy and your industries better is when you invest in innovation, because innovation is developmental in nature itself. If you want to talk about making our industries better, innovation is the way to go. But what we think this debate should have been about was whether governments take control of this innovation or private and governments coexisting. What they want to talk about of innovation, ladies and gentlemen, will further on why innovation is good. But what we think, what our stance is from opening opposition is that we think the importance of coexistence between private and government corporations developing innovation, but it is important for the government to continually drive this culture of innovation. Firstly, I'm going to rebut whatever they wanted to talk about. See, what they need to realize is the growth of a nation, right? Innovation is part and parcel of that, because innovation drives benefits in the long term. It is not about creating, it is about enhancing, and it's about reaching our goals faster, something that benefits us anyway. Secondly, we think that if you want to talk about sustaining better growth, innovation drives better quality of products, better quality of services. What we talk about is that when we execute our process much faster, because that is what innovation drives, then we achieve better growth in the long term. And if your biggest problem is talking about how the government has lack of money, then that is why we have loans. So the government can always take these loans. What we think is realized is that innovation is something that makes money in the industry, right? Next, we talk to you about progress, right? The progress that we need to that he wants to advocate for is that we use the same ways to address our problems. What this means is that the problems always remain the same, and we always take the longest way to solve those problems. We think what innovation does is that we address new ways to address these problems, and we solve these problems faster than under your model, right? Because what developmental programs do, right, you continually review them. And we think that what happens then, innovation provides better alternatives, better progress under our side, not yours. See, 3 points I'm going to talk to you about why it's important for innovation to have, why it's important to have innovation, why it's the government who needs to drive innovation, and 3, why it's not about private corporations only. Before that, closing.
When you mean leading innovation, do you mean solely at providing funding, or do you also want government institutions dominating those innovations?
Ladies and gentlemen, I've already told you it is about the coexistence between government and private corporations. But who drives this innovation? Who instills this culture? It is the government, and that is what we are fighting for today. Listen clearly next time. Now, on my first point, no, sit down. How our economy benefits from innovation, right? Because innovation is about the process itself, how we better find new ways to fix a problem, how faster. What we need to realize is that individuals, right, innovations is driven by mentality. And that is why the government needs to incentivize this culture of innovation. Because one of the benefits we get is that we continually find new sources of revenue, new sources to better develop our economy. Under our model, we encourage economic growth, something you wanted to propagate. Secondly, now we're going to talk to you about, no, sit down, right? About why it is the government who must drive this innovation, right? Because let's talk about the characterization of governments. Governments are rich. And if you want to say they're poor, they can take loans. Secondly, we think that governments have the negotiation ability. They are the ones who are able to import talent. They are the ones who can enter relations which are beneficial to our innovation. So why we talk about the government, right? Because firstly, we think that private corporations don't have enough resources to develop our market. What this means is that they will never have a natural incentive to enter the market. They'll never have a natural incentive to propagate this culture of innovation, which I have so many best, which I've told you about. No, sit down. See, what our premise is, right, that the government continually invests in this, and private corporations can either assist our government directly or indirectly, doesn't really matter. What's important to realize is that the government needs to continually invest and drive this culture of innovation. No, sit down. See, next I'm going to tell you why we don't have private institutions driving innovation alone. Because the private institutions are characterized like this, right? They are profit in orientated. This means that they may look at high potential, but if the risk is also high, then they're not going to contribute to that because they have no incentive to do that because they don't necessarily see a return in their investments, right? What this means is, no, sit down, is that there are no interest to develop the talent that we need to drive innovation, right? And what this means is that they'll also continually work in a limited environment. Like if you want to argue they will develop talent, it is only in the environment that only benefits them. And this is problematic because innovation needs to be driven across the board, across the nation, right? Because all private industries will only be focusing on what is relevant to their industry. That means is you don't have an overall benefit to the growth of the economy. What this means, what means that the industry eventually doesn't mean you grow your economy as a whole, doesn't stimulate the economy enough. Thirdly, fourthly, we tell you, right? What happens and if beyond 2020, because the motion calls for that, if the government is removed from this process of innovation, then individuals will have no interest in developing our economy, no interest in this innovation process. What this means is that our economy will not grow in a substantial way, and this is detrimental to the economic growth they wanted to propagate. What have we told you today? We told you why it's important for innovation to exist in our economy. Secondly, we told you why the government must be involved in this process and why private corporations are not incentivized to help and why this better helps us after Vision 2020. All those reasons we are proud to oppose.
Madam Chair, back in the 90s when we watched Back to the Future, everybody thought that by the year 2020 or by the year 2000, we're going to have the skateboard that can float on air. Right? At that point in time, we were very inspired. Yeah, I think this is an in thing, it's something that we want to go to. Like, but now, if you really analyze it realistically, like where has that dream gone? Like I think that innovation as a concept is a great thing, but I think you have to compare and contrast it as to where a nation is heading and whether or not it's a material gain by the nation to continue on invest all those innovation. Therefore, this deals with most of the airy-fairy thing that was presented by the opening opposition, because all the things that they say that innovation is a good thing are all just like theoretical concept of why innovation is good, but not necessarily tell you exactly what area do you want the government to innovate, as to how much profit you garner from this from the area that you're innovating. I think that those are the kind of like analysis that was lacking from the side of the opposition. Let's firstly analyze their claims. Like, innovation create better quality and it solves problem better. Like, I mean, what problem are you talking about, isn't it? Like, if you really want to address problem, wouldn't it be better for you to focus on existing problem that's existing in the current things that you're investing in? Like, there's still various problems with regards to improving the public transportation system. There's still various problems as to how do you make sure that the rigging of oil is done more efficiently. We think for you to create that incentive for improvement, it's better for government to specialize things that they already have knowledge of and the things that they've already invested in. Why? Because when you have specialization, this is when we think you can create a better quality product because you can have a more extensive research on it. And this is how we compare and contrast to innovation. Because when it comes to innovation, you have to start everything from scratch, because this is this contrast with regards to the specialization that you're talking about. We think that since you're already heading in a direction where we already have a knowledge on a certain industry, just focus on those industry and this an area that we don't know of. Deny. Let's analyze the second thing. They said, oh, now private corporation don't have an incentive to come in because the government don't do so. We don't see that. Why is that a problem? We took a neutral stance as to like innovation isn't really something that's really necessary, especially in the perspective of the government. If the private company choose not to do so, we don't think there's as much harm as you want to talk about. You need to establish for this argument to fly, you need to establish harm when you don't innovate on something new. I think this is something that they didn't do in today's debate. Closing.
So, when you innovate, are you then developing? And when you don't prioritize innovation, are you then not prioritizing development?
To oil rigging, right? Like there are still various ways for you to improve, like to make sure that the cost of production of rigging is in fact being improved. I think there's still an existing area within the current investment that the government is doing to make sure that it's more effective. Like deny, right? Let's analyze what I'm going to give to this debate. I'm going to give two extensions. Firstly, I'll analyze how innovation creates a turn back in profit and revenue by the government, which is contradictory to the beyond 2020 that we want to talk about. Secondly, I'll talk about how focusing on things that we know creates a better branding and creates a better form of growth by the Malaysian economy. Let's firstly analyze how do you turn back profit and revenue by the government. Let's analyze now what happens when you choose to invent on innovation. We have to take a look at the balance sheets of the government, because right now, status quo, government is focusing on areas they're already developing. I think a lot of money are already being channeled to things that was mentioned by Arman, and you can already create better efficiency. So what happens when you go into a new area that we don't know of, right? It involves cost. The government has money now. It involves cost, right? So you have to compare and contrast, right? When it involves cost, at the current rate, when the government is focusing on things that already specialized in, our GDP is slowly increasing by year by year to achieve the status of a high income nation. What happens when you start involving and funding in innovation? What you're going to do then, you're going to take a portion of the profit that you already garnered by the areas that already have and spend on an innovation. This is when we think the economic growth of a country you're garnering revenue from an area that you already have, but at the same time, government expenditure increases because they have to spend on or venture things that are already new. Why do we think that this expenditure is unreasonable? Because firstly, you have to analyze when it comes to innovation, it's a completely new thing, meaning that the government have to start everything from scratch. They have to train everyone from scratch. They have to build the infrastructure from scratch, and they have to understand, they have to really develop on their own how to make things more efficient. Within the running cost or the overhead cost or starting cost of innovating is so high, we think that the government will have to continuously invest in innovating, and therefore leads to lesser revenue in the government. The parallel to this is that when you want to start off in building a factory, that the running cost of the factory is definitely going to be high. If you want to analyze the innovation sector is an absolute, but you're always going to have a negative balance sheet with regards to this sector. Furthermore, how is it going to be bad? Because if you really analyze innovation, it takes a goddamn long time for you to be able to achieve something. Like the concept of like smart homes was there for the past like 20 years as close to that. Like hovercraft example, is it hovercraft? Yeah, hoverboard that I mentioned earlier, we are not even getting close to that. We think that if you really want to invest in an area, you need to find a balance as to whether this area will be able to create a good outcome. What you're eventually going to have when you start off something, you have to start everything from scratch, and the balances of the government will start to reduce, and we're not able to get the we want to. Let's analyze how we're going to get better branding to specialization. If you analyze as to how people respect as a nation, is that when those nations is able to develop and specialize on certain things and build better those areas. Take a look for South Korea. They build good branding with regards to Samsung phone, like America and the US on an iPhone, right? So we think that we can just go ahead with those because we're already good at oil and gas, we're already good at providing services, we're already good at tourism. We think that we can create a better branding where all the government funds are concentrated in those areas. When you focus on things like innovation, government have to, like, let's be honest, the government in Malaysia have to, and you know, when got many things to handle, and they're prone to leave certain sector behind. We think the specialization and the we want will create better branding, will attract people to come to our country even more. In conclusion, we think that the burden coming from the side of the opposition, they need to prove to us what's the net value of this innovation and how is this innovation is going to fit the nation in reality and not in theory.
Yeah.
Side opening government's solution to the presence of unskilled labor is to discard that labor, spend a lot of money on importing labor, because teaching them has a probability of them not understanding what they are being taught. Side opening government is lobbying for a government that is absolutely conservative in all its approaches, and a government that has no vision for development. Also, they assume Malaysia will die by 2020 because under their model, we're only doing what 2020 requires us to do, and beyond that, well, we'll figure it out then. The biggest issue with side opening government is they're also lobbying for the removal of all government and development industries. Let's look at what innovation is. And I'm sorry I have to give an English lesson in a bloody English debate. Innovation is developmental in nature. I think Nitya was quite clear on that. Development is inherently contingent on innovation, because if you're not innovating, you're not developing. You're doing the same things over and over and over and over again. That's what Nitya told you. Trying to solve a problem through solutions that already exist will only give you outcomes that are guaranteed and exist. But we're not looking for guaranteed outcomes, because no developing nation has gotten to the stages of being developed or close to what South Korea has gotten to without investing in the innovation industry. A huge chunk of Nitya's speech was primarily not just about why innovation is important, but also what processes are involved when the government is involved in the process of innovation. What do we see? For innovation to occur, you need individuals who are capable of participating in the system to drive this innovation. It means you'll invest on talent, you'll invest on education infrastructure, you'll invest on holistic development. And the other part of her speech was about why holistic development is important, until and unless you can prove to us why Malaysia should only continue to invest on the palm oil industry and perhaps the factories in Penang. As far as the IT industry is concerned, you can't win this debate. Why? Because the specialization they're fighting for and the focus on only what exists today only leads to an economy that is singular in nature. But the most successful economies of today are diverse. Why? Because you don't want to... Why? Because, for example, in an example of investment, if you invest all your money with a single company, if the shares of that company tanks, you are dead. But we're not an individual who can afford to do that. We are a nation that holds an economy that helps 30 million people to survive. In other words, when the palm oil industry crashes and petroleum prices go down, or you run out of petroleum, because you don't innovate in green technology and finding ways to optimize your petroleum digging or excavation, what then do you turn to? Well, I guess you can just sit down and have teh tarik. That's what they want you to do. Because when we face a problem, we try to discuss it over a cup of tea. Do we try to change our habits? No, that's what they're pushing for. So I'll move on to a little bit more specific rebuttals, and then I'll tell you what makes a developing nation push to becoming a developed nation. The difference between countries like Malaysia and Singapore in terms of how much they take risk in order to create development, and why the probability of development is something that is good, even if it's low. But before that, anybody?
You have to ground your innovation on the ground as to what type of innovation are you talking about, and why is it worth in spending when you don't even know the success of it.
No, you see, your problem is fakri. You only see one side of economic development. Sorry, not fakri. Yeah, faiz. Sorry. Your problem is you only see one side of development, but economies are multifaceted. Economies require investment in multiple industries. Moving on. So first they said, where did it go? Well, I guess I responded to everything that they said. But before I move on to my arguments, the one thing that the economy needs to do is provide the most conducive environment for the development of nascent industries and industries that can help us in the future. South Korea's entry into the smartphone market was primarily because the government was conducive towards creating MNCs. Same thing applied for the US and a lot of other nations. Actually, no more POIs. Sit down. So what am I here to talk to you about? It's about how we can become a developed nation from a developing nation. Ultimately, at the end of the day, what drives progress in a developing economy is risk-taking. Conservatism doesn't bring us anywhere. Why? Because conservatism only creates the same results over and over and over again. What does risk do? Risk means you invest in industries that have a high likelihood of making money, as well as industries that you feel are relevant to you. What does that mean? If I want to innovate in the development of technology that would assist in the enhancement of the extraction of palm oil, that helps my palm oil industry, which is a specialization you want to talk about as well. So the difference that we have here is that it is not mutually exclusive for you to develop the economy today for 2020 and innovate. The biggest problem they have is only that we have a limited amount of funds. But how have developing nations ever gotten from being poor to being rich? It's not by complaining that they're poor. It has always been about reaching out to external resources, such as loans, in order to be able to develop nascent industries, because the development of a singular economy ultimately means that you lose a significant amount of market diversity. But what happens when you only rely on a singular economy? Investment as well is only driven when the economy has a multitude of opportunities. But more importantly, the government's spending in terms of the industry of innovation is not going to be to the extent they are trying to make you believe. Because the investment in innovation is also about creating a conducive environment for other people to innovate. In other words, when we talk about people like Intel, Mercedes, BMW in Malaysia, they need the government to have a conducive environment for innovation. We need to have things like tax cuts or for environmentally friendly cars. That is funding innovation at the end of the day. And now we then also transfer the liability to individuals within the sector. They're lobbying for an absence of any government involvement within the industry. They need to justify why the government shouldn't, at least in worst case scenario, be involved on a policy making and a legislative level in order to induce innovation within the private sector. Nitya extensively told you why the private sector, even if they do get involved in innovation, will only be involved if they are pushed. The minimum we're expecting from our government is to create that environment. They're removing that environment altogether. So what do we from side opening opposition stand for? A couple of things. We tell you that innovation comes with a lot of auxiliary benefits, or at least the fight for innovation. It comes with education development that spills over to other industries. And we tell you the government is very rich and has a moral obligation or a duty, responsibility to push for the ability of individuals to reach a level of business actualization or business revenue that is beyond what it is today. Because you don't enhance your business revenue by maintaining the same branding strategy. It is by varying your brand. So ultimately, as a nation, Malaysia's goal is to provide as many opportunities to its own businesses and businesses outside the country to invest in the country. The only way to do so is to provide a platform for unconventional businesses and unconventional investments to grow in this country.
What is innovation? Innovation is an idea that comes from the market, right? That can be commercialized for the whole world to use, right? We think that this means that most of the biggest innovations that are probably made by private companies, right? We give you an example of online banking, IT development, transportation, and medicine. They're mostly not made by the government, but made by private institutions themselves, right? We think that we need to understand that. But let's clarify on site closing government. What do we mean by taking the back seat? What we mean by taking the back seat is that we're phasing out funding towards these private institutions, towards all these projects, but we still will facilitate private companies to fuel those innovations instead. For example, we give you, what we mean is this. Like for what we see that government does in right now, right? We see number one, they enforce laws, right? So they make sure that when you have this property, and you want to sell it, then the government will enforce the laws, make sure you don't breach that contract whatsoever. We give you another example of IP laws, right? We see that when, let's just say, when a company creates this groundbreaking thing, we think that if they trademark it, the government has to enforce that trademark and ensure that no one breaches that contract. Sit down. Also, we also think that they are used to facilitate agreements, right? Having forums, we think that they set up monetary agencies such as Pemandu, right? We see stuff like that, right? But here's what we mean, right? Governments right now, what they always do is that governments aren't always directly for like controlling any innovations that are being made, but more of facilitating it and letting it happen, right? Before I move on to my extension, no, sit down. A rebuttal towards opening opposition, because this is what they say. Individuals will have no incentive to invent any new things without the government itself. No, individuals are mostly private companies. They don't give a damn about whether the government is to make profit, and how they make profit is by innovating things, right? So you see that under their paradigm, it doesn't really make sense how all because sit down. How suddenly we'll stop, right? What they're trying to push to us is they're trying to push to us that, oh, it's important, right? We're going to prove to you under our side why innovation is better when the governments take the back seat. Other than that, no, sit down. Firstly, why is it better for private companies to take the leading role? Because the companies have much more power to commercialize information, right? First of all, first level, they have financial freedom, because we see governments, right? They not only have to take care of for technology and innovation, right? They have to take care of many other aspects in the whole country, right? They have to take care of military welfare. We think that once you have to split this, their financial capability lowers down, right? But here's the thing. Government, even if they have money, they have to cater to what people want, right? So let's just say people demand more welfare. What the government has to do is cater towards these people, even if they want to focus on technology, right? We see that the government is binded towards the society because they're more populist in nature. They need to cater to what the people want. So in the end, we see that in the end, they're binded by these people. However, under our paradigm, right, private companies, they don't have to cater towards these people. They don't have to focus on making these people happy. They just have to focus on innovating. They only have one field to focus on, right? We think that it's so much, there's less bending and it's so much easier on the outside. Before I move on, yes.
Innovation, especially in today's context, is very important to the medical industry because it's a never-ending cycle of innovation. You'll find with governments not pumping in money to improve the medical system.
Okay, we think that once you pull out, right, at least governments, at least the private corporations have time to at least realize that, okay, our funding is going to be taken away. We still need to make more money. Then in fact, we think it could be even better, right? Because then you incentivize you to stop lazing around and make that invention faster, make that innovation faster, because in the end, then you get it better, right? But we see, like, sit down. We think that private corporations such as Pfizer or something like that, the private company who made Novotin, which is a groundbreaking medicine, right? We think it's so much better when governments sit back and let people innovate, right? Sit down. Secondly, we think that private companies have much more better networking, right? Because they already established a brand image. We think that they're much more popular than the government. Why? Because the government is split into, because not everyone loves our government right now, right? Some people don't like the government, some people love government. So let's just say we want to commercialize this particular innovation that we just made. No one will really actually listen to the government if you're against the government, right? We see that the opposition party, the people who support that, the impact won't be as much as on them, right? But private companies, we see that's different. Why? Because private companies, they not really have any people going against them or not, right? They're just there to innovate and make new projects, right? So we see that under our paradigm, it's a lot better when they do it, because in the end, they have the better commercialization, and not everyone in the world hates them, right? Everyone's actually going to listen to that. Sit down, no more. And we think that branding is always better. But why is it better this way, right? When private companies and organizations take the leading role, we see that now they're free from political entanglements, right? Because now they can do whatever they want. They're not afraid to make criticism. Okay, because we see governments, right? If they are the ones who make the innovations, they are afraid of criticism from other political parties, and they don't need. And we see in places like Malaysia, right? Like Petronas, for example, if they want to innovate green technology, Malaysia won't, because they have huge power and they have huge interest to make sure everyone still wants oils, because Petronas is their main funder, right? We think that private companies, they don't have that problem. Do you think that they are incentivized even more to make new innovations down, because of the main reason that that's how they make their money, right? But governments, however, they wouldn't be as incentivized. It wouldn't be in their interest as much as private companies, for the main reason that because let's just say if they're tangled with Petronas, who funds them a lot, they wouldn't want to make green technology because that would jeopardize Petronas's sales, right? Sit down. We also think that private companies are individual bodies and they aren't influenced by anybody else before 6 years.
Look, you have to recognize that her needs and the wants of people are constantly changing. But because the very nature of private sectors right now, we're going to constantly focus on the things that are working for them now, we need to recognize that the government is the one that's going to constantly innovate new things to cater to the needs of market people.
We don't think that's necessarily true, right? Because private companies, obviously, if they're making money now, right, if they actually make a new groundbreaking innovation, the money will increase a lot, right? Because we see, like, let's just say, we see many people already, like, let's just say smartphones, right? We see that when it first invented, everyone was buying it, but now in the end, you're it's like leveled out, right? Many people already have that idea. In the end, you're not making as much money as you used to, right? All these companies will be incentivized to make better innovations because it's the main reason that facts, and it looks being that private companies still have the incentive to improve their thing, to improve their. But here's the thing, right? They're always, so we think that in the essence, right, we think that all these companies, private companies, who are not binded by any decisions, who are not scared to make unpopular things by diverting money into that particular area. We think that private companies already have their own interests. They already have the incentive to do it. We think private corporations are a lot better.
Yeah.
The context is moving beyond 2020, but there are two very important key sectors in the economy that require constant innovation, especially being driven by governmental portals: medicine and renewable energy. And because it's a state responsibility for the continuous pursuit of energy and continuous innovation of medicine. I will do two things for you. Number one, we're going to talk about these two key sectors and how you hamper any sort of bright future beyond 2020 when you're not able to innovate medicine, when you're not able to innovate and find renewable energy, because the kind of energy companies that are around now are far more happy sitting on the billions of dollars they make from the current oil, and therefore you stifle innovation when you lose government, when they have a social responsibility for it. Secondly, this is a debate about innovation from private companies. We've got to talk about the cost of those kinds of innovations and access. We've got to talk about the kinds of research and how you stifle the longevity of those research and the time it takes for the public to access those kinds of research. And lastly, how intellectual property laws and patents will come into effect and make the access to these kinds of things so much more difficult. Two rebuttals before that. The entire government bench, and I can't believe Closing Year also took this on, they said the government just has too much to do. That's not an argument to just stop innovation. That we're talking about, you guys are stopping funding. I need to know the government's overarching responsibility that apparently is too diverse and too much for their own portfolios. What correlation does that have in funneling money towards the kinds of innovations that you have now, when you want to stifle the kind of talent pool that currently works for the government, because there are limited capacities of corporations that are able to take on researchers and R&D from the public. So essentially what you lose at the end of the day is the kind of talent pool that currently works for those kinds of governments, and we're not willing to lose that talent pool, especially in the two sectors I'm going to talk about. Secondly, we heard from Closing Government, private companies don't pander to public will. Yes, they pander to money. Therefore, the kinds of innovations that you talk about will not necessarily be as diverse as what the public generally needs beyond 2020, and will continuously focus on the sectors that they think are most important, particularly the sectors that generate the most amount of revenue. That's why you need governments in order to diversify those kinds of portfolios, and we think that's a problem. And then they said, we're not scared of the public. That essentially means in verbatim that they're not accountable to the public for them to be scared of the public, and therefore it's fundamentally harmful. Not yet, Deborah. Sit down, guys. So the two sectors that we need to focus on beyond 2020 that will still remain a government foresight will be renewable energy and medicine. So firstly, renewable energy. One, this is about sustaining way beyond the point we're dependent on oil. Why? This is a state responsibility at the point in which you fail to innovate the ideas of energy like wind turbines and solar power and things like this. The state becomes complicit in those failures because they fail to have a hand in looking for innovations and methods of the way out to remove the dependency that we currently have on oil. What you have instead on the government's model is an overarching complacency where they continue to just focus on oil and coal as those kinds of energy, as forms of energy that will eventually run out. And we think therefore it's a problem. The converse is this: corporations don't have a moral obligation to innovate when it comes to things that to innovate renewable energy. If they're making billions of dollars from the kinds of energy systems that they have now, companies like Shell, Petronas, ExxonMobil, and Chevron are never going to sell away their oil assets and remove their talent pools and start gaining access to green technology because it's just not profitable. So the kinds of focus that you have now on the energy sector beyond 2020 is going to be a massive blowout, because then you don't have the kinds of innovation or the kinds of people looking into those kinds of innovations that are fundamentally very important if we're talking about the future. Not yet. So therefore, do we think the innovation that you're talking about, absent of these government portals, are going to be strictly focused on the ones that bring back the most amount of money now, which is oil? Conversely, what you also have are huge oil lobby groups that generally dictate the kind of political sways in terms of what happens in parliament. Couple that with the absence of funding for innovations of energy, the government will definitely be complicit in the failure to find renewable energy at the end, and it's a total failure of responsibility of them as a responsible state. That's why, even if you think it's the most minimal amount of funding that you can afford, state intervention and the inclusion of states in this kind of renewable energy is important. Medicine. Healthcare is a socially universal responsibility of a fundamental state. There is no current incentive for big pharmaceutical companies like Allergan, like Pfizer, to ever innovate new drugs that are required by the public if it is not in mass need. That means diseases that are generally penicillin resistant, diseases that are resistant to current medications like malaria and the common flu, they're not generally needed by the mass amounts of public. The kinds of innovations that you have from big pharmaceuticals, the kind of technologies that they look at, are the ones that probably serve the mass populace of people. The select few individuals that suffer from these kinds of things lose out when states don't have that obligation anymore to fight for you in terms of looking for those kinds of innovations and the kind of technologies that can help the select few people that suffer from these kinds of exclusive and isolated incidences. We think that is a general problem. Secondly, we think the talent pool that currently exists in the public sphere when it comes to research and development, fundamentally in medicine, we can't lose that talent pool. One, the kind of research and development specialists that we currently have are already so limited in both the private and public sector. But there's only a limited capacity in terms of how much private sectors are able to employ the kind of talent pools that they have, because they're generally profit driven. They're going to want to keep their costs generally low. What you're willing to concede on that side of the house is a loss of a huge and important side of talent pools when it comes to R&D, because they won't be able to find jobs when it comes to the private sectors. Not everyone is looking to innovate the medical industry. I'll take Deborah.
In a globalized world, even Ebola in East Africa is able to travel to US, which is why you still have private companies innovating into cures for Ebola.
No, that's true. I will completely agree with you. But that doesn't remove the fact that we don't need the government as a player when fighting Ebola, because it's Ebola. You wouldn't want the US government to say, we don't care, we're not going to fund the research of Ebola. That just doesn't make sense, right? It's a state responsibility when it comes to healthcare. Secondly, what happens to the price of innovation? Well, you think it's going to stifle innovation for a number of reasons. One, when you leave private corporations to do this, the cost and the produce of that innovation becomes far more expensive. That leads to access problems to the middle class and generally people who live in the rural areas. And this goes universally across the board when it comes to things like education, development of technology, construction, and infrastructure. Access becomes a problem because innovation becomes expensive when you allow profit-driven companies to do this alone. Secondly, when you look at research, there's a limited amount of money that companies can spend on research because companies generally prefer making money now. Therefore, the priority is always to focus on hot sectors that are currently existing in the status quo and deprioritize innovation as a secondary option. But intellectual properties then become far more expensive because you don't have government bonds and government tax money to sort of subsidize the patent laws or buy out patent laws to make these kinds of patents accessible to a lot more people. You make the cost of innovation and access of innovation far more limited and expensive when you only allow the private sector to do this. We need government's intervention and government funding, or else a lot of us will be in trouble beyond 2020. Happy to
The biggest problem with opposition is that assume taking a back seat means letting go and not doing anything. You cannot expect us to defend that you will not do anything when contract laws and IP laws are violated. You cannot expect us to say that we will just ignore our SMEs, not just not funding them, but not even providing any loans, which is why Luke's characterization was very important into exactly what we are going to do. 3 parts of my speech. Firstly, the entirely dismissed extension, a brilliant one coming from Luke, and then I'll look at CO, then look at OO, and tell you why we win this debate. Firstly, Tim conveniently ignored the very nuanced analysis that came from Luke. The primary problem about government spearheading innovation, and we are talking about funding here. If you're reliant and waiting for the government to fund and spearheading these innovations, the problem is that the government is tied down among an entanglement of political burdens. 3 levels. Firstly, you have catered to your political will, as in you have the accountability to the people. Sit down, and that is a good thing because it's merely the government doing its job, which means you cannot please anyone, and that's okay with the government. Which means there is a need to delegate the need for innovation to private companies, right? Which means no, thank you. Sit down. Which means when you talk about innovations that are not as popular or not as innovative in your local context. So, for example, contraceptive methods that are not as popular in in conservative nations. Those wills the government has to cater to, and you cannot fund those kinds of researchers because people are just not going to be happy, which means that you have to be dependent on private companies to make those changes. No, thank you. Secondly, your idea of corporate influencers, which Tim actually tried to talk about, right? Corporate influencers is this, that he said private companies will never have the incentive to venture into green technology because fuel is so lucrative. Sit down. The comparative is not whether Shell wants to go into green technology or fuel. The comparative is whether the government chooses to fund Shell or green technology. And when you have such close ties with Petronas, when all your cronies are in there, when the lobby power is there, you just cannot pander to both the needs, because funding green technology means Petronas and Shell will not make money in future, which is why there is no such conflict of interest in the private sphere. That means you will give the power, facilitate the loans, facilitate the laws for green technology companies to have those innovations. Lastly, on commercialization, because there is a splitted idea of branding on what the government is and how it is very splitted among people. As opposed to private companies, especially MNCs who have a very established and popular brands such as Apple, Samsung, Honda, all these things that are very immediately relatable to people, they will make it much easier that people will immediately buy into your kinds of new innovation, as opposed to, hey, government, right? If I look at another product with the One Malaysia logo on it, bear with me, I tell you, I will not buy anything of those tagging. Hi. Yes.
Malaysia is not popular for its automotive industry. Nobody cares about investing in innovative automotive industry in Malaysia. Considering it's important to diversify your sources of revenue as a state, which private industry is going to bother investing on making Malaysia an automotive hub if the government does not?
I'm being streamed, right? Just give up on Proton. We're not making money. We're making losses, right? And it's very easy for us to just import on those kinds of innovation. What we really need, right? Okay, let's look at CO and OO. CO, renewable energy and medicine is where we engage with them. Renewable energy, like what I talked to you, is about the lobbying, it's about the funding and the political tensions, which is much efficient if you just leave it into the private sphere, because they have the ability and freedom to just innovate as they wish. But secondly, when you talk about medicine, right, this is the contention from Tim. Medicine, that government, you need the government funding, the government will to have these innovations, like those things. But when you look at all the groundbreaking medicine from the past into today, almost everything, 90% is by private corporations, because they are the ones that have the direct profit and they make money out of it. Government's calculation is based on not profit, but based on maybe it's a nice thing to do in the next election, and I can show them that thing. It is not an important interest for them to inherently uphold, as opposed to the interest of a private company. If I don't make money out of this project, I will not survive. That is why you need the private companies. Much innovation for Ebola is currently under cooperation with WHO and private company, not any government. private companies will have less incentive to venture into innovation because they don't want to take up the risk, right? So companies are risk averse. But we don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because when you talk about risk, it's all a calculation on how you make your decision. And government is okay. We think government should be risk averse because in fact, you are taking your taxpayers' money. In fact, you have to take into your political will and all those things. If you're really talking about who is more willing to venture into new and uncharted waters, it is the private company. Companies are selfish, then self-interest. Firstly, we are okay because we're not talking about one company. There are thousands of each companies out there. If they're all selfish, it's okay because the product of that selfishness is still a whole diverse of innovations and products. Even the government cannot cater to every needs and are inherently conflicting, right? When you talk about green technology industry, for example, if you really want a multifaceted company, a multitude of opportunities, as said by both opening and closing opposition, the comparison is this: the resources and the political burden that a government has versus the resources of not one or two companies, but the whole market and the whole economy of thousands and thousands of private companies. When they each venture into their own selfish and their own selfish project, we think the outcome is good. Because when they're leading the innovation, essentially they are having much more, they are loose away from all these political ties. They are able to spearhead those movements. We cannot wait for government to fund our innovation. We have to stand at the forefront. We are very proud to propose.
Sorry, confused you.
Sebab baca doa makan dah dia cerita dengan bagus lah.
Yeah.
All right, now that you
Renewable energy sources and medicine is not only an issue in today's debate, but it's also a social issue and my inherent right to obtain. We think that the moment you allow the government to take a back seat within these issues specifically, you are now hindering my rights, my social rights to obtain these things at its best possible quality, but at its cheapest price. We are not willing to defend that, and we think from closing opposition, we take today's debate. What am I going to talk to you about? I'm going to talk to you about the biggest issue that encapsulates this entire debate, which is why is the complete privatization of innovation extremely detrimental? Because we have to recognize a few things that the entire government bench sort of conceded to, right? They conceded that innovation and development are two different things. We don't think so. We think that the moment you innovate, it doesn't matter how big, you are still improving your system and you are still developing in nature. However, this was that the government is only going to look at things that the government wants. Yet, we also need to recognize that the government is also accountable to the people. That's why Tim's speech was exponentially important, because he argued to you why the government was then accountable to these people, hence diversifying the form of innovation. When you juxtapose the government's form of innovation towards private corporations, we don't see that form of diversification. Why so? Because private sectors are only going to do things that work now. We are not willing to support that. Let's look at the contentions that Deborah tried to bring up. Sid, I didn't see you standing. We need to look at the idea that she contended on medicine. Because, apparently now medicine can still achieve its same glory within the private sector, especially during private innovations. But we don't think so. We think especially now when big major corporations have big breakthrough research on super contagious diseases or super popular disease, like super dangerous diseases, we think that it is the government's duty now to buy over those intellectual properties, to make it accessible for the people on the ground. Because you cannot possibly assume that the amount of research and the amount of money funneled into research and development of this certain medicine, that these private sectors are going to hand it out to the people at a cheap price. Because the very profit-oriented mindset of these private sectors, they are never ever going to do that. You need the government to buy over these intellectual properties. Hence, the government can never take a back seat in innovation, because the government needs to take an active role to make sure innovation is accessible not only to the people who can obtain it monetarily, but also to the people who are monetarily disenfranchised. But also we need to look at the idea of why public sectors cannot develop this even further, right? Because there's not just diseases that are super contagious like Ebola, but there are diseases like the common cold that the companies are not necessarily going to focus on because it doesn't generate a high profit margin. We think that it is the government's inherent duty to make sure that these form of innovations exist within society. And we don't think that the proposal coming from government takes this debate. Let's move on to the issue. Before that, anyone?
Buying over IP is not innovation. It's not a business transaction. So, tell me which of any of these groundbreaking drugs that you talked about is funded by the government?
When government will take, you don't provide accessibility to the people on the ground. You cause even more harm that we are not willing to support. Let's look at this issue. I've taken one. Take a seat. The idea of privatization is very the idea of complete and utter privatization is very harmful. Why? Because we need to look at, number one, the nature of these private corporations, right? I've already told you why they are very profit-oriented. They care too much about making a profit, generate the highest profit income. This means they will be less incentivized to have these services or products or these innovations to be of a lower price. And this is exponentially harmful, because in Tim's speech, he already talked to you why you now limit the disposable income of the people. You segregate now the lower income people because they can never be able to afford this, but you also cause a bigger harm, especially when you don't provide accessibility to the people on the ground. Because the profit-oriented nature of these corporations, we need to first identify that not all innovations are going to bring a profit margin.
This means you are then causing the versatility or the diversification of these innovations to be very, very limited, because now private sectors are not going to look into innovations that are not going to generate them a high profit income. We give you examples of like very basic example of creating a system that can provide clean water to the people in Sarawak. This is a non-profit making innovation, and hence private sectors are not going to be inclined to opt into it because of the very nature of being profit oriented. Second, we also need to recognize that renewable energy, as this is what Tim talked about, is very, very expensive to innovate. Research and development does not always generate revenue, right? And we think it is going to be disincentivizing private corporations to want to innovate even more, because now they don't have an incentive to create new innovations that are related to these things. They would rather stick and invest within those innovations that are going to generate them even more money. And we think it is very, very harmful. Why is this so? Because now you stifle the very access of this innovation. Geographically, the private sector does not necessarily see a profit margin within the rural areas. But number two, you then lose the extra people or the talent pool that Tim talked about that is present within the public sector. We have to recognize that the private sector is never going to be as big as the private sector is never going to be as big as the public sector, hence losing the very talent there. But also, now you cause intellectual property to start stockpiling, right? In terms of medicine, where these large private healthcare companies are going to continuously stockpile their innovations and sell it off to the highest bidder. We don't think you can sell medicine, especially innovations regarded to medicine, to the highest bidder, because it's my social inherent right to obtain this form of innovations, because it best helps me develop my social welfare as a whole. For all these reasons, and because we think that a side closing opposition was best able to provide a grounding towards this debate, we think a side closing opposition deserves to be in the final.
Yes.
Sorry, it was a regular.